Our first panelist is coming to us where I believe it is currently 6:15 in the morning in New Zealand. So I want you all to welcome James Urry, a venerable scholar of Mennonite history and a retired academic at Victoria University of Wellington, where he was reader in anthropology. James is author of very well-known books on Mennonite history, None But Saints, Mennonites, Politics, and Peoplehood. And fun fact, he published in the very first issue of the Journal of Mennonite Studies the same year that I was born. So James, thank you for joining us and getting up early. We're grateful to have you, and we look forward to your presentation before and after the time of chaos, the wider context of the Mennonite emigration from Russia and immigration to Canada, 1900 to 1926. James, the floor is yours.
Kia ora. Right, could I have the first slide, please? I've decided to talk about three periods, although it shows 4 here. I've left out the time of chaos, and the reasons for that is this is the immediate cause of the Mennonite migration, and it's been very carefully discussed. Let's begin with the first, which I've called the Age of Menonite Capitalism. Can we have the first slide, please? Now, well, the next slide, right? Good. Now, capitalism is usually discussed as a rather negative category, but as you can see, I'm going to use it purely as a technical sense, and you can scan this while I talk. Now, Mennonites talk about the period before the First World War, often with the phrase, the golden years. But I want to talk about it as the period of capitalism, especially high capitalism, when perhaps the Mennonite economy was the most developed. It had intensified throughout the 19th century, and after 1900 was a very complex economic and social world. As you can gather, I'm going to talk more about economy and society than any other topic. Now, the economy was based on agricultural production. Sheep had disappeared long ago, and the economy was basically grain-fed. But the people, well, not grain-fed, but based on grain, particularly wheat production. Now, this was produced by the Mennonite colonists, but also outside in large estates and in areas of private land, which the Mennonites had purchased, mainly during the 19th century. But there was also a more complex economy because some of the grain was milled, some in very large mills, although some of the milling had been very unsuccessful. But there was also increasing technological innovation, and some of that innovation was in fact produced in Mennonite factories, which increasingly produced a range of mechanical things to assist with farming. Now, the type of society that the Mennonites had during this period was increasingly complex, not only those in production, but also those who serviced this industry. But the whole world was actually based not only on machines, but also on cheap labor. This cheap labor was produced by non-Mennonites, particularly by Ukrainian peasants and by seasonal Russian labor. Now, the Mennonite society was complex. It didn't just consist of farmers, but teachers, service industries, and a range of other things. I like to think of this period as the time of Mennonite high capitalism. There were also a set of very complex institutions to actually support this. Not only schools, but hospitals, orphanages, schools for the deaf, and various other things. Now, all this was to end, not really end, but be particularly shattered by the First World War. Now, the First World War has been not well studied by Mennonites. It usually appears in what I call 2 particular forms, positive and negative. The positive descriptions deal with the Mennonite service, particularly in the hospital and medical services, which reached right out to the Russian front. Now, the negative consists of the attempts by the Russian state to actually redefine Mennonites as enemy descent, and therefore to attempt to seize various parts of their property. This did occur in various areas of Russia, although it varied in different areas. Some of the people could actually restrict this, particularly big landowners and factory owners, by the use of bribes, a practice which they actually developed before 1914. Again, a topic rarely discussed in the Mennonite literature. But what has not been discussed is the impact on the war on the Mennonite economy and Mennonite society. Quite obviously, the war affected the production of crops. There was a great shortage of labor. Not only that, exporting the grain, as today in Ukraine, was a problem. Most of it went through the Black Sea and through the Dardanelles. Now, the problem was that Turkey had joined Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire against the other factors. Therefore, grain export was severely restricted. Not only that, but again, a subject not discussed greatly by Mennonites, although Professor Venger and various other Russians and Ukrainians have discussed this, is in fact the takeover of a great deal of the Mennonite industry and its retooling. Now, the economy in wartime changed radically for all the people involved in the war. By 1915, they began to run out of ammunition. They thought the war was going to be short. Therefore, the production of military goods, especially ammunition, became crucial. The Mennonite agricultural centers were in fact often retooled to produce war material, including shells and ammunition. The point which I'm trying to make here is that the time of chaos had already become chaotic for Mennonites during the First World War. So when, in fact, Russia withdrew from the war and the Germans occupied Ukraine and then withdrew and the time of chaos began, the whole Mennonite economy had been severely restricted. Sorry, I keep licking my fingers. I keep moving things. Now, I want to move on to the period of which I've called Reconstruction. The period of Reconstruction under the Soviets, who basically gained power in 1921. Although they gained power, they did not actually control a great deal of the country, which had been devastated, and in Ukraine had been severely devastated. So actually Reconstruction took a period of quite a bit of time. Not only that, periods of famine and disease complicated factors increasingly. Can we have the next slide, please? Hopefully. Now, in 1921, to assist Reconstruction, the authorities decided, the Soviet authorities decided to institute a very new economic system. This is known as the New Economic Policy, which the Mennonites refer to as Nobbs-Thiessen. I wrote an article on this many years ago because in spite of the vast literature on Mennonites in and after the following of the war, they in fact hardly ever referred to this period, to this particular policy. Now, the policy, as you can see displayed, hopefully, I've arranged this diagram with the dark bit being the earlier thing on capitalism. Whoops, we've moved on. Can you go back a slide, please? Right. And underneath, I've compared it with the NEP. As you can see, some of the things are actually interrelated, but some of the things are severely missing. This includes private ownership of factories, private ownership of mills, and of course, private ownership of estates and large private farms. There wasn't anything to do about this because the factories had already, in a sense, been semi-nationalised and hadn't been operating during the time of chaos, but also the private estates and large private farms had been seized by peasants and their owners had fled. They fled, in fact, to the Mennonite colonies, which, though they suffered, particularly Khodchenko, because it lay on a strategic crossing of the Dnipro River, they didn't go home and they were looked after by relatives and friends and other people in the colonies. And these people, at least in 1923 and 24, are the bulk of the people who would, in fact, be the first echelons of the migrants, of the immigrants to Canada. To put it bluntly, the Mennonites in the colonies got rather fed up with all these refugees, some of whom had also come from far away, like Terek, whose new colonies had been overrun by tribesmen. Something had to be done, and moving them out, perhaps to Canada, became an option, even while the Canadians restricted entry until 1922. So, in fact, Reconstruction began really in 1923-24, once you started to move out the large number of immigrants and people began to farm in the new NEP system. Now, I did some figures yesterday looking at the differences between the different emigrations. One of the interesting factors is who came to Canada with cash payments. This reflects how well they had done in the early years of NEP. People still wanted to leave. Some people, though, wanted to stay. None of the 1923 immigrants who you're talking about today paid for their migration with cash. They were poor. They, in fact, took loans. In 1924, 23% paid with cash. That's still quite a small number. But if we look at 1925 to 1926, almost 60% of the people came to Canada with cash. Now, this quite clearly reflects the changing nature of NEP and its success. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, these are very rough figures, but as you can see, these figures reflect the increasing success of NEP on the Soviet economy. You can see that the Great War, 1914 to 1917 in Russia, caused a bit of a crash in the economy. The Civil War, in some ways, changed things, but you can see the tremendous recovery in NEP. This had an effect on the Mennonite migration because the type of people who left in 25 and 26 came with that cash economy and improved things. This raises the issue, why did they come? Well, one of the things that needs to be discussed perhaps is this question of who came and who stayed. It wasn't that Mennonites who'd been brought up in a capitalist system were madly excited by some features of NEP, but it actually allowed them to be petty capitalists again. The option of emigration quite clearly was an option which they wanted. We don't know fully what was going on in the minds of Mennonites in this period, but some probably thought that the system would actually become more sympathetic to their earlier experiences. Some even hoped that perhaps the Soviet system might actually fail. But there were also Mennonites who were somewhat attracted to the new ideas and the new ways with the hope of a new society. Again, something which has perhaps not been investigated. Of course, we need to turn to the other reconstruction. This is the reconstruction in Canada. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, although the way these figures are calculated are not equivalent, we can see here some aspects of the Canadian economy. You can see that the Great War affected the economy quite badly. The end of the war, there was a sharp recovery. So Mennonites entered quite a prosperous Canada, or at least one improving. And you would have thought that they did well. But if we actually look at the basis of reconstruction for Mennonites in Canada, you can actually see that perhaps the world wasn't quite fine for them in their circumstances. Firstly, in terms of economic reconstruction, they had little or no capital. Sorry, that's my 15 minutes. I'm nearly up. Farming was different ways. Sorry, I'll get rid of this silly machine. Educated people couldn't follow their ways. They were generally dispersed across the, they couldn't regroup. They were spread all over the place. They attempted to regroup. My new book coming next year on Grunthal shows that in fact, some did regroup, but unfortunately, they didn't get on well with some of the other Mennonites who regrouped with them. It's no wonder that life reconstruction in Canada was a lot harder than in Russia. Now, I've run out of time, but I'll leave you with the last slide, if you can put it up, please. One of the things I wanted to just mention is that there's a great deal of interesting comparison that can be done, not only about the reconstructing bureaucracies that the Mennonites constructed in the Soviet Union. Mennonites were wonderfully bureaucratic, and they still are, and the types of bureaucracies which they recreated in Canada. There are differences and similarities which I don't have time to go into at the moment. It's interesting that some of the leaders of reconstruction in these bureaucracies in the Soviet Union actually managed to migrate towards the end of the period when they could and joined the bureaucracies in Canada. They were very different characters. I'm talking about C.F. Classen and B.B. Yance. This is a whole field which I think is worth investigating. But as I've run out of time, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, James. We'll move right along, and our next panelist is Natalia Wenger. Natalia is a professor from Dnipro National University, and since the Russian invasion over the last 2 years, she's been a visiting scholar here at the University of Winnipeg and a very dear friend over that time period to all of us in Mennonite studies. She's published 2 monographs about Mennonites in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and she has also participated in these Mennonite conferences before, all the way back in 2001 and more recently in 2012. So Natalia, welcome to the stage. It's all yours.
Thank you for coming. In the title of my presentation, there is a word, game. It sounds a little provocative, since we are talking about such a dramatic stage of Mennonite history. Can this approach be justified? Let me explain. When I first started researching the history of Union of Citizens of Dutch lineage in 1990s, the Ukrainian Archival's collection presented the organization as a thriving Mennonite cooperative, which operated in 173 settlements. It was a multitasking organization. We had a set of goals, including Emigration one, and successfully led the colonies on the way of their reconstruction. Then I read the Union's paper for the eternal Mennonite youth. The highly emotional correspondence of B.B. Jens with leaders of foreign Mennonite organization proves that emigration was a priority of the Union's activity. Thus, 2 different groups of sources unveiled the Verband as an organization with different self-presentation. with 2 major and many minor missions. I believe that organization achieved its goals by manipulating their tasks. In my presentation, I will avoid retelling the history of Mennonite Union, but I would discuss the art of strategies. That I mean as an art of political game, which ensured some success of the Verband as an economic organization, as well as institution that acted the Russlaenders' emigration. After 1920s, the Mennonites found themselves the citizen of another political state, Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Formally, it was an independent country, but treaty with Russia had been signed in 1920. Thus, Ukraine was dependent on Russian Republic. New economic policy proclaimed by Bolsheviks provided the Mennonites with some economic and political opportunities. Deadly famine, which could sweep fragile Bolshevik power, was a persuasive reason for rapprochement, even though the temporary partners, state and the Mennonites, understood short-term nature of their partnership. I would like to go through all these conditions because they predetermine the strategy of Mennonite Verband. First, under the condition of economic collapse, the Bolsheviks supported so-called advanced farms, which were not subject of land division. Second, after 1921, there was a great interest in the development of the cooperative movement. The cooperatives run by the religious group were extremely supported. Next, despite atheistic propaganda, the sectarians were treated more positively than other state churches. Registration of congregations, including the Mennonite ones, was proclaimed, and successfully registered congregations were allowed to own their property and establish industrial enterprises. Then, further, in 1922, Ukraine became one of the republics of the Soviet Union. The state system had become two-tiered structure, with a lot of discrepancies in attitude towards the Union. That gave a space for maneuvering. It was also important that the Union was run by the representatives of new Mennonite elite that claimed itself in 1920, as Dr. Eisfeld showed. I believe that new leaders had more dynamic consciousness and were ready for reasonable compromises. At last, because the Bolsheviks needed to cooperate with local and tolerant to the Soviet power elites, they pursued the policy of entrenchment or indigenization, which aimed to recruit the non-Russians, including the Germans, into Communist Party and state apparatus. So, those were the conditions, and our next question is how the Mennonites responded to these opportunities/changes. What was their art of strategy? Strategy number 1, to bring the situation and resources under control to protect communities. Once the power in Ukraine became sustainable, it was important to take control of the situation, people, and their resources. As the cooperative movement was encouraged by the government, the Mennonite idea was to gather all the resources in one Mennonite cooperative. Reconstruction was declared as the main strategy, while other goals were mentioned as the supportive ones. On the other side, the Mennonite society was riven, and reconstruction was important for those who still preferred to stay. Despite promising legislation, the Mennonite had a hard time registering the statute. Their religious nature was an obstacle. The barrier was overcome when the title of future cooperative was changed, not Mennonite, but Dutch Lineage Citizens Union. All Mennonite lands and farm enterprises were included in the equity of the organization. Mennonite institutions were recognized as the property of the Union, and that was a victory. As it had been said, the authorities were reluctant to approve the statute of the Mennonite organization in 1921. Under the condition of famine, the Mennonites declared themselves as facilitators of foreign aid. This strategy can be explained by the formula 2-in-1. If you're ready to accept Union, we are providing investment for Ukraine. Famine had already broken in Volga region and becoming a reality in Ukraine. The Mennonites needed help in late 1921. MCC was ready to deploy humanitarian activities in Ukraine at that time. However, Lenin believed that any donation from abroad would bind the Soviet authorities under their conditions. Only in the summer of 1921, when people died by thousands in Volga region, the Soviet government appealed to all honest people in the world. Bibi Jens was involved in negotiations between American Mennonite Relief and government because the fate of Verband depended on the negotiations. The negotiations were difficult, and according to Lev Kamenev, a prominent Soviet politician, could collapse every minute. Jens recollected that Bolsheviks liked the promise to provide food for all the groups of local population without respect to nationality and region. By cooperating with MCC, the union became a co-sponsor of economic reconstruction. AMR provides the union with 25 tractors that had to increase government interest in the Mennonites. International economic cooperation in various forms was fixed in the statute of the Union. That strategy could provide international contacts and funding crucial for both emigration and reconstruction. Facing numerous issues, the Union had to conduct a dialogue with the Soviet politicals and executive institutions on their three levels: local, all-Ukrainian, and Soviet Union levels. It was clear for the Mennonites that the Verband would be tolerated as long as the crisis of power and famine continues. Jens mentioned that Kharkov government and executive institutions were more kindly disposed towards the Mennonites. As they were really responsible for the region development, ideology gave way to rationalism. Jens mentioned that Moscow had a different perspective, and the leaders were caught between two fires. In contrast to executive institutions, the police, GPU, attitude was hostile. In 1923, the first anti-Verband statement could be heard. The secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, Molotov, demanded to strengthen communist propaganda among the German population. The GPUs visited colonies. It always caused victims to the Mennonite. Over 100 Mennonites were in custody in 1921. In 1923, Deputy Chairman of GPU Yagoda presented a report about activity of German intelligence in USSR, where he claims that German population was involved in espionage. GPU insisted on deportation abroad of those Mennonites who did not support the Soviet power. The local administration was the toughest one to keep a dialogue, but it could be bribed. Bribery was an expedient way to solve any problem, and Jens admitted it. Also, he briefly mentioned the Mennonite had bribed politicians in the Russian history empire. He confessed. The means deployed were not always impeccable. There were always men championed Mennonite interests. Then, of course, there was also the money. Jens also mentioned about bottomless Bolshevik stomachs and the fact that some of the local officials were former Makhnovets. In December 1921, when the first death has been already documented, 3 officials visited the colony and grabbed food with the words, "You are expecting aid from America, but who is going to help us?" Personal connection, friends and informals help to keep the enemy on the field and control the state of different issues. In the sources, we do not find many names of Soviet functionaries. However, some references indicate their impact on the destiny of the Union. While Mikhail Skripnik, the Minister of International Policy, was a consistent atheist, Pragmatic Yermoshchenko considered Mennonites itself for economic recovery. Jans gained some support from Vasily Mantsev, who led the NKVD, but before he had been appointed as the head of ЧК. Mantsev was born in the family of old believers, was a friend of the famous Bolshevik and scholar Bonch Bruyevich, who studied Anabaptism. In personal conversation with Jans, Mantsev criticized radical atheism, wished the power should be more flexible and rational. Jans characterized Meissen with the following words: "If the communists like Mantsev ruled Russia, things would be much better shape." Mennonites also had informants in the corridor of power. In his letter, Jans sometimes mentioned about private conversation with officials both in Kharkiv and in Moscow. The land issue was essential for both parties. The point of the Mennonites was to shift it from the political to economic domain, presenting it as a part of their reconstruction strategy. Despite the promise in legislation about advanced farms, land redistribution was carried out. Confiscated land were given to landless Mennonite, but were allocated in land funds to establish new, not Mennonite villages. During the famine, when power accounted on the Mennonites' famine skills, there was a chance to influence the practice of land redistribution. Verband put forward some demands and persuaded the government that positively solved land problem would help to prevent the immigration. Also, the first government response was negative. The Mennonite requirements were taken more seriously in summer 1922. It should be said that authorities never ignored land issue. However, the Mennonite colonies were overpopulated at that time. That caused the lack of lands. In July 1924, Wojcik decided that Mennonite farms, as developed commodity farms, could receive additional plot lands. And it was a little victory. Okay. Jans believes that immigration work cost the union it had. However, objectively, the problem was more dramatic. A new version of indigenization, Sovietization policy was being implemented, and the union was influential among the Mennonites, hindered the government plans. In summer of 1924, the leaders of the union noticed an exceptional attention to the activities of the union and immigration. In December 1922, Katerinoslav Committee of Communist Party insisted on the dissolving of the Mennonite organization. In 1925, the government began an open offensive against the Mennonite Union. Since the dissolution was named as a reorganization, the Mennonites used their last chance. Their aim was to establish a new border, the Bureau of Representatives Mennonite Cooperation, to regain their resources back. This alternative border was categorically rejected by the authorities. Mennonite last attempt was a request to establish a position of Mennonite Cooperation General Commissioner. It was unsuccessful. In 1924, sectarians and Protestant cooperatives were called false cooperation. To sum up, the art of strategy in its different forms, which was demonstrated by the Verband in the first half of 1920s, predetermined achieving some positive result of their activity. At that time, the Verband, the Soviet power, both had hidden agendas behind the facade of agreements among them. It was temporary alliance. The Soviet power was transforming itself into political Leviathan, and Ukrainian Mennonites couldn't resist to this evil. Dictatorship permeated all spheres of social political life. Given a context of the time, any tactic of political maneuvering was perceived as a political revolt, and political enemies were to be eliminated in the Soviet Union. Mennonites could no longer control their lives. A new stage of their history was arising. Thank you.
Thank you, Nataliya. Our next presenter will come right up. Ad van der Staaij earned his MA in Eastern European History from Utrecht in 1985, and he's currently finishing a dissertation on the relationship between Dutch Doopsgezinden and Ukrainian Mennonites, focusing on famine relief and reconstruction projects in Wallachna from 1920 to 1938. Ad, come on up.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure being here. I will start immediately because I have only 15 minutes. It's well known that from 1923 the North American Mennonites provided much help to fellow believers fleeing the Soviet Union. Less known is the story of the support of the Dutch Doopsgezinden for these refugees. I will call them Doopsgezinden because there will be an issue about their identity, whether they're being Mennonite or not. In my presentation, I will outline the main features of this support, and I will focus on concrete aid to refugees from the Soviet Union. Secondly, a brief consideration of the identifications between Doopsgezinden and Mennonites, and the reasons for ending the support. In June 1924, 2 Mennonite families from Ukraine arrived in Rotterdam. They were on their way to Mexico and visited the church of their fellow believers in Rotterdam. They wanted to thank them for the famine relief the Dutch Doopsgezinden had provided in 1922-1923. On Whit Monday, the 2 family fathers walked into the church where Pastor Simon Gorter was preaching about the Good Samaritan. When he had finished, the 2 men approached Gorter, introduced themselves, and thanked him for the Dutch relief. Years later, Gorter looked back at the moment and concluded that we made a connection and did not fail to deepen it. Gorter accompanied the men to the immigrant hotel. He found 2 families in attic rooms with an infant in a cupboard drawer from Russia converted into a cradle. On June 4th, the first group left for Mexico. The Doopsgezinden were impressed by the stories of the hardships in Russia and noticed that the refugees needed help. In the next weeks, 3 more groups of Mennonites followed. They had almost no clothes, had difficulty finding their way to the authorities, and some were ill. A month later, July 24th, Gorter and a number of members of the Rotterdam Doopsgezinden congregation founded the HDEB, the Hollands Doopsgezinden Emigrantenbureau, the Dutch Mennonite Board of Emigration. Its main task was to provide Mennonite immigrants on their way to the Netherlands with information, advice, and assistance. In the years that followed, the HDEB would collect approximately 250,000 guilders, which is 100,000 US dollars at the time, for various forms of refugee aid. This aid can roughly be divided into 3 periods. The first period covers the years 1924-1929. At that time, the Rotterdam Doopsgezinden were mainly concerned with helping immigrants who came to Rotterdam to take the boat to Mexico. The aid consisted of providing clothing, agricultural tools, and medical assistance where needed. Because it soon became apparent that it was difficult to build a good life in Mexico, the HDEB also mediated in attempts to change the destination to Canada. It succeeded in a number of cases, but is implicated that the immigrants had to comply with the strict Canadian health requirements. If trachoma was diagnosed, the HDEB provided good medical care and a place to stay at Rotterdam Doopsgezinden families. The stay could take a few months and in some cases even up to 3 years. Large-scale financial support was not necessary since most immigrants had sold all the positions in Russia and paid for their own passage. But many of them had little extra money left because the Soviet authorities had extorted a lot of money from them. Some had been robbed along the way. From them, the HDB advanced the cost for the papers needed to enter Canada. During the short or longer stay, close contacts were established between the Doopsgezinden and Mennonites. The emigrants visited the church where the sermons were given in Dutch and German. Mennonite singing made a great impression on people of Rotterdam. For distraction, a corner in the church was converted into a reading and conversation room with devotional literature in German and children's toys. Adults were taken to model farms or cattle markets and trips were organized for the children. In this way, the Rotterdam Doopsgezinden helped about 1,000 refugees on their journey to Central or North America between 1924 and 1929. The second period concerns the years 1929-1931. At the end of 1929, about 4,000 Mennonites, mostly Siberian, managed to flee the Soviet Union via Moscow. They were received in Germany and taken care of in Mölln, Prenzlau and Hammerstein. The spectacular flight attracted the attention not only of the German press but also the Dutch. In December, the HDB started a fundraising campaign that was unexpectedly successful. More than 60,000 guilders were collected in the first 3 months. In January 1930, board members Gorter and de Jong went to locations to find a proper destination for the collected money. It was not easy because the German government generously offered help and no extra money was needed for the shelter in Germany. But the government did expect the refugees to leave for America before spring. The North American Mennonites did their best to get the refugees to Canada. When it turned out that this was not possible, they found opportunities to settle in Brazil and Paraguay. Because there were many German colonies in Brazil, the German government put pressure on the Mennonites to leave for Brazil. So the first group gave in and the HDB decided to use the money to support these immigrants in building their colony in Brazil. In the course of 1930, it became apparent that there were still Mennonite refugees in Harbin and the Middle East who also needed help to make the passage to America. The HDB worked together with the MCC to realize this. New groups that came to Brazil, such as the Harbiners from 1931 and 34, could also count on support from Rotterdam. The third period concerns the aid to the settlers in Brazil between 1930 and 1938. Between January and March 1930, about 600 Mennonites arrived in Brazil. They were received by representatives of German colonization organizations and were able to settle in the valley of the Krauel and the Stolz Plateau. Until the first harvest, they were fed by the German organizations. After that, they were left to their own devices. By the end of the year, they had cleared areas of farmland in the jungle and built their first homes. They were happy to receive money from the Netherlands to purchase building materials, to erect a church and school buildings. Each family received money to purchase a cow for their own livelihood and as a basis for a herd, the so-called Holländer koe. As appreciation for the support, they baptized the main settlement with Marsum, and the street and the school were named after Gorter. In November 1930, the colonists founded a corporation for which the HDB provided the starting capital of 17,000 guilders. The first year went well and prospects seemed good, but it turned out differently. The colonies were relatively isolated between 3 ridges. The small Krauel Valley offered few opportunities to form large estates as the Mennonites in Siberia and Ukraine had done. It soon became clear that people could survive there, but that they would not be able to achieve the prosperity they had enjoyed in Russia. Moreover, with the arrival of new refugees from Harbin, overcrowding soon set in. From 1933, many young people sought work as laborers or domestic servants in towns outside the valley. The Mennonites looked to the HDB for help, but for various reasons, the HDB had less and less resources available. It was raising funds for the Mennonites who had been starving in Ukraine since 1932, for the remnants of the refugees in Harbin, and for the World Collection to help pay off the travel credits many refugees had received in the 1920s. Because the global crisis also affected the Netherlands, the HDB did not raise that much money as in 1929 and 1930. But with the money left from the first collection, the HDB was able to pay the salary of 4 teachers and give a loan to set up a starch factory, which would provide employment. Although the HDB had invested more than 100,000 guilders in the colony from 1930 onwards, many Brazilian Mennonites led a life barely above the subsistence level. This led to internal tensions that also had repercussions on relations with the co-religionists in the Netherlands and North America. In 1915-1917, the Mennonites had invoked their Dutch origin to escape anti-German measures by the Russian government. To what extent did this origin play a role in the context between the HDB and the refugees? The Rotterdam Doopsgezinden and Russian Mennonites identified themselves as each other on the basis of both origin and spiritual direction. After the first meetings with the Russian Mennonites, the quiet Dutch Doopsgezinden, as they saw themselves, were deeply moved by the serious and pious spirit which for them was an example of fidelity to principle and courage of faith that made them a bit ashamed. The simplicity, high inner culture and modesty of the Russian Mennonites was inspiring. The Rotterdammers could identify with the convictions of most of the refugees, but not with the rigid conservatives who reluctantly listened to the female assistant pastor. The refugees reminded the Doopsgezinden of what once had been their principles. This led Adriaan Binnerts, an influential Doopsgezinde preacher from Haarlem, to doubt whether the Doopsgezinden still belonged to the worldwide Mennonite Brotherhood. After all, they had abandoned almost all ideas, that of the congregation without spot or wrinkle, the separation from the world, the refusal to hold government offices and to marry outside the congregation, the weerloosheid. Principles counted for them less than practical action according to a Christian mind. Fortunately, the participants of the World Conference in Basel in 1925 dispelled his doubts. The Dutch Doopsgezinden definitively were part of the Brotherhood. The aid to the Russian fellow believers will certainly have played a role in this. Although the Doopsgezinden identified themselves with the refugees primarily on religious grounds, they were also struck by more secular similarities, such as their names, which pointed to a clear origin from the Netherlands, their facial features, the shape of their farms and windmills they showed on photographs. When in November 1929 the first reports of the march on Moscow were published in the Dutch national press, there was talk of the German origin and the German essence of the Mennonites. This was soon corrected. They were not of German origin, but a distant offshoot from the Dutch tribe. A series of articles was published about the Dutch and German Russian farmers then. But Gorter kept a clear head about this. He wrote that the Mennonites had long since left the Netherlands and had strongly been shaped in recent centuries by the stay in German areas. Nowhere is there any reference to the use of plowdicht, in which the Mennonites might have tried to make themselves understood to the Doopsgezinden in the Netherlands. After 1933, the question of the national essence of the Mennonites, whether Dutch or German, played a major role in cooperation with Benjamin Unruh in supporting the Brazilian settlers. Unruh saw the Mennonites as the bearers of Deutschtum in the world. They had to hold on to their language identification with the German motherland. This was reinforced by the support of the German government in 1929-1930, and after the Nazis came to power in 1933. Just like the Nazis, Unruh saw the Mennonites as an exemplary Germans who had defied Stalin. He prayed for Hitler. Unruh expected Hitler to defeat Stalin so that the Mennonites could return to the Russian motherland. This led to tensions in the cooperation with the Dutch. The Dutch Doopsgezinden had some sympathy for Mennonite identification with Deutschtum, but not with Hitler and his anti-Semitic thugs. When Unruh's protégé and convinced Nazi Jacob Quering started interfering in internal affairs of the colony during a study trip to Brazil, the HDB gave off a warning. If the Mennonites starting to behave like Nazis, they could forget about support from the Netherlands. Unruh was the HDB's main advisor and support for Brazil, but the HDB board also maintained direct contacts with the leaders in Brazil, Heinrich Martens, Peter Classen and David Nickel. Gorter had met Martens in Hamburg in 1930. After his arrival in Brazil, Martens kept the HDB informed about the colony's progress. Gorter and Unruh trusted him completely. However, they had difficulties assessing his position. They approached Martens as if he had the position of the Oberschulze as it had existed in Russia, the main representative of the Mennonites, recognized by local government, who also had police powers to maintain order. But Brazilian law did not recognize this role. So Martens was completely dependent on the trust placed in him by the settlers. And their confidence was lacking because Martens originated not from Siberia but from Crimea, and because he had handled the elections carelessly. In addition, the position of the director of the cooperative, Heinrich Leuwen, was recognized by Brazilian law. Since the HDB had given Martens the responsibility to manage the Hollandkasse, the funds from the Netherlands, he tried to use the Dutch contacts and money to maintain this position against Leuwen. This led to quarrels, a stalemate, and departure of Martens in the spring of 1932. At the advice of Unruh, Peter Classen arrived from Germany in the spring of 1932 to mediate and prepare proper elections, and Classen took over the Hollandkasse. But he had even less authority than Martens. Leuwen used his position to postpone the elections. He succeeded until late 1936 when the settlers elected David Nickel as the new Oberschulze, still a position without a mandate from the Brazilian government. In early 1937, a power struggle broke out between Nickel and Leuwen. Nickel received the support of Quering, who was in Brazil to do research for a book on the Mennonite colonization in South America. Quering intimidated Classen, who complained to Gorter about this. Classen forced the board of the HDB to take a position, but the board felt incapable because it was overtaken by the quarrel. Unruh disclosed all kinds of gossips about Classen, the man he had initially recommended. Unruh called on the HDB not to thwart Queering. After half a year of quarreling and throwing mud, Classen, Leuwen and Queering left. In the autumn of 1937, Nickel finally seemed to be able to establish the order the settlers longed for. Combined with the diminished support and interest of the Dutch Doopsgezinden for the Brazilians, the economic stagnation of the colony, and a rapidly declining confidence in Unruh, the HDB board wondered whether it wanted to continue the relations and if another collection was necessary. In February 1938, Gorta asked the Dutch envoy in Brazil to investigate the colony. Unfortunately, he was unable to visit the settlements. The envoy assumed that the Mennonites fared as well as most German settlers and were able to survive without foreign help. In the spring of 1938, the quarreling in Brazil was resumed. The board took stock, wrote to Unruh that it was getting tired of the incessant bickering between the settlers and had decided to stop the support. The settlers were allowed to keep all invested money and use it for economic purposes. Embarrassed by Rotterdam's generosity, Unruh and Nikkeld expressed their deep regrets that years of collaboration had to end in such a sad way.
All right, and the final presenter on our panel is also a virtual presenter, so I hope Elena Khodchenko is with us. She is an associate professor in the Department of World History at Dnipro National University. She holds a PhD from that institution as well, which is focused on Mennonite immigrants to Canada and the United States, which she defended in 2011. She's also visited Winnipeg to conduct research through Platt Foundation grants. So, Olena, welcome, and I hope you can hear us. I'll turn the floor over to you.
My report, the immigration of Mennonites of Ukraine during the geo-economy policy. And I would like to start my speech with a question. What definition would be appropriate for assisting the immigration of Mennonites from Ukraine as a part of Soviet Union in the 1920s? Voluntary, forced, or voluntary forced immigration? And my research was focused on the push factor that causes the second wave of Mennonite immigration from Ukrainian lands to Canada. For more than 130 years, Mennonites and other European diasporas have been creating a multicultural space in the south of Ukrainian lands with the developed system of economic ties. However, the challenges of the late 19th and early 20th centuries shook the benevolent attitude of the authorities towards the Mennonite community. Before the First World War, Mennonites occupied a leading position in the economy of South Ukrainian lands. During the war, they, despite the anti-German rhetoric in the press and the liquidation laws adopted by the government, supported the efforts of the state in the fight against the enemy. Their losses in the war were about 100 people. However, during the civil war, because of killing and epidemics, more than 2,000 people died and up to 1,000 became victims of the famine. These upheavals pushed many to want to leave the country. What was stopping them? Loss of property and land, a sense of home, and the lack of leaders at that time who could head the exodus. And in addition, there was no country ready to accept them. The United States and Canada adopted restrictive immigration laws, and in Germany, revolutionary chaos and famine reigned. In 1922, the situation in the Ukrainian SSR began to change. At the initial stage of the new economy policy, adopted laws chewed up the Mennonites. At first, the tax in kind was replaced by the fixed tax, the nationalization of small enterprises was stopped, wage labor was allowed, the rights of rural post committees were limited, and proclaimed and carried out support and encouragement of private business corresponded to the mentality of the Mennonites. At the same time, land-lease colonists began to receive plots of land and also Wer received the help from American and Dutch humanitarian missions. These positive developments were clear, especially given the recent mayhem of the period of war communism and severe famine. Was this sufficient to refuse immigration? Could the Mennonite community, with their characteristic worldview, fit into the society of the Bolshevik management with a strict atheistic policy? We should say that in 1922, this was not yet clear. However, in subsequent years, the situation changed, which led the Mennonites to mass immigration. And at first, I would like to put your attention on the relationships between Mennonites and the authorities. The progressive laws of the new economy policy were carried out by provincial and district authorities. The district executive committees were supposed to control the village council. Their task was to carry out the policy of the Bolshevik party in the countryside, relying on the poorest, peasantry, and committees of the poor. The Soviet government tried to find mass support about the poor Mennonites, but it was difficult. It was a situation aroused in which the chairman of the village councils were incompetent and didn't know German language and custom of the Mennonites. Issues unresolved in the village councils were transferred to the executive committees where more literate people worked, but they perceived the Mennonites as an anti-Soviet element. But the questions accumulated in the community. Why, contrary to the laws, the confiscation of land and houses continues? Why the lessons of law of God and ceremonies are forbidden? Why is the right to participate in election being revoked? It should be noted that the region and district leaders were unable to understand the points of the new economy policy. The government's reforms seemed to many of them a retreat from the gains of the revolution and a renaissance of the bourgeoisie. They often sabotaged the implementation of laws. The Mennonites had to learn to respond to the challenges of the new situation, and Torres were sometimes hired to resolve important issues, and over their time they organized the Union of the descendants of Dutch immigrants in Ukraine. The union took the function of a negotiator in the regions and districts. If questions at this level were hampered, they applied directly to the government in Hague. This irritated and angered the local party leaders. The Mennonites managed to attract the attention of the all Ukrainian Executive Committee to their issues. In 1924, the committee condemned the actions of the local authorities regarding the problems of the Mennonites and demanded the restoration of legality. However, despite the direct indication, the expected results did not follow. Moreover, in revenge, the Yaroslav Executive Committee initiated the discrediting of the Union, accusing it of anti-Soviet activities and supporting of the Gulag. The next push factor was land issue. Having come to power, the Bolsheviks began to pursue a policy of new land management. In the Mennonites who owned more than 40 hectares, part of the land was expropriated. At the same time, some of the land lists were given from 16 to 32 hectares of land. The laws of the NEP period gave rise to the Mennonites' hope that in the conditions of the food crisis and famine, land alienation would stop. The government supported these hopes. The Mennonites were allowed to keep more land in their possession than Ukrainian peasants received. However, local peasants were dissatisfied. They demanded equal rights to all. District and regional executive committees were entirely on their side. The consequence was the continued alienation of land from the colonists. The expropriation took place with the numerous violations. The government knew about this, but was forced to make concessions to the peasant masses. In addition, the high harvest of the 1923 diminished the issue of hunger. And an official of the state openly declared to the leader of the union, Jan, that they did not want a confrontation between the Mennonites and the surrounding people. And if they leave their land to them, then the neighbors will destroy the Mennonite communities. The economic situation of the colonists worsened. Moreover, Mennonite refugees from other southern regions became a burden for the colonists. Several thousand refugees arrived from the Volga region alone, and the government paid attention to the problems of the Mennonites only in 1924, when the commission in the report indicated that one of the main reasons for the growth of immigrant sentiment was the lack of the land. The answer was a resolution of the All-Ukrainian Executive Committee to provincial committees, which included, at first, to stop the alienation of land in the colonies. Second, speed up land management with the provision of land based on the norms for a commodity production up to a maximum of 32 hectares. And third, land found in the colonies to be used executively for Mennonites. This ruling cheered up the Mennonites, and the result was a reduction in the number of applications to leave. However, the provincial authorities sabotaged this resolution. The government once again in 1925 tried to improve the land situation of the Mennonites by using however, the provincial authorities sabotaged this resolution, and the government once again in 1925 tried to improve the land situation of the Mennonites by issuing an order to expand the land found of the colonies by 21%. But this did not change much. So the Mennonites stopped believing in the government and gave them hope 3 times, but did not put into the practice. The next question was taxation. An indicator of Mennonite oppression was unfairly high taxes. In 1924, the financial authorities established a tax on Mennonite households according to the 6th and 7th category, and on neighboring Ukrainian villages according to the 3rd and 4th category. It was more by the 50–90%. In 1924, the All-Ukrainian Executive Committee instructed to revise the taxation of Mennonites. However, the tax on the farms of Mennonites continued to exceed the tax for Ukrainians by 2 categories. The next question was the restriction of religious freedoms. The decree of the Soviet government on the separation of the church from the school became a real threat of destroying the Mennonites' worldview foundation, based on the religious postulates of early Christianity. The intervention of the government into religion questions began in 1921. Preachers were removed from schools, the lessons of God's laws were banned, and anti-religious agitation was carried out. The expulsion of prayer house from the school was painful for community. Also, under the forbidden were the ritual customs like weddings and funerals. Repressions against preachers who remained the most influential persons in the communities during this period were limited to depriving them of participation in elections. The pressure on religion intensified from 1927 when the arrests and exiles of preachers began. Another important issue for Mennonites was military service, which was contrary to their doctrine of non-resistance, and exemption from military service could only be obtained through a contestation. After the 1926 exemption from it on the basis of pacifistic belief practically ceased. The next question was connected with the inter-ethnic relation. The complicated inter-ethnic relation between the Mennonites and the indigenous population did not cease with the end of the Civil War. During the next period, the confrontation continued. Threats of physical violence were often heard from the peasants. There was an attempt to deport Mennonites from a number of settlements and to settle Ukrainians and other ethnic groups in them. The issue of rent and alien was also manifested in the fact that the new authorities of the colonies did not include representatives of the Mennonites. The next question was banditry. Banditry remained a consequence of the period of the Civil War. Farms were robbed, horses were taken away, and it was indicated that the police did not investigate these cases, seeing men as enemies. There was a manifestation of state lawlessness in the form of the expropriation of Mennonite public property, for example, the equipment of a hospital and a powered land in the Orlov colony. The next question for the Mennonite community was the policy of Ukrainization. In 1922, the Bolsheviks Politburo raised the issue of Ukrainization of the school curriculum. However, this was not done because of the lack of teachers who spoke German and Ukrainian at the same time. In the same period, the Ukrainization of office work was introduced in the colonies, which led to the misunderstanding and failure to comply with the orders of the authorities. And the next question, the intervention in the cultural life of the Mennonites in the period of the new economy policy. During the period of Soviet rule, cultural dissonance also became expressive. Literacy among Mennonites reached 100% and among local business hardly 20%. The Mennonites who built codes of life based on the Holy Bible were alien to the vices of the new society. Theft, rudeness, indifference to one's neighbor, drunkenness, obscene language were often vices characteristic of Soviet party, atheist and society of this time and incompatible with the culture of the Mennonites. The authorities tried to destroy this culture artist and reduce it to the level of the Sovietized peasantry. And at least the personal motives for immigration. Of course, we can see that all of these factors that influenced the desire of Mennonites to emigrate from the country were present in the minds of the majority. At the same time, it should be noted that this did not lead to the complete exodus from the territory of Ukraine. The reasons for this were both opposition from the Soviet authorities and the desire of part of society to adopt a new condition. According to Soviet political authorities, more than 75% of Mennonites did not support the new Soviet order. And as a conclusion, we can see that the loss of the new economy policy and the support of the Ukrainian government in matters of the private enterprises and preferences in land provision in the initial period of the new policy distinguished the immigration mood of the times of famine, setting the Mennonites to restore economic activity. The community during this period wanted to ensure economic and social stability, try to free itself from the immigration from landless co-religions and refugees. Nevertheless, after the 1924, the mood among other Mennonites regarding immigration began to change. As we described earlier, many reasons pushed Mennonites to immigrate. At this time, thanks to the leadership of the Union of the Descendants of Dutch Immigrants, financial and logistic support from compatriots of Canada, the South Ukrainian Mennonites showed their characteristic mobility. Thus, they saved thousands of lives of their brethren who could have been crushed by the moloch of Soviet power during the Holodomor and repressions of the 30 years and the deportation of the fortress. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much to our four presenters. We are going to take time for questions, and we'll push a little bit into our coffee break, so about 10 or 15 minutes. We've got 2 roving microphones. Jeremy's down here on the floor, so just stick your hand up if you've got a question. Michaela's up there, and yeah, we'll proceed. And I'll keep an eye on the chat, too, if we have any virtual questions. Well, I always like to jump in while we're waiting. So, Ad, I have a question for you. I was really fascinated with the dynamic about supporting migration to Mexico through the Dutch Doopsgezinden relief. Did they exert any diplomatic pressure to ensure that there would be a reception for Mennonites that were moving to Mexico, or was it purely sort of financial support for people who had already made their plans?
Try to talk in this microphone. Now that's a difficult question. There had been discussion about emigration to Mexico or potential to Mexico earlier than 1924. So there have been attempts to intervene through Dutch Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and whether it would be possible to get the Mennonites on a kind of Dutch citizenship to Mexico, because then the opportunities would be bigger for them. So that was a discussion in 1921. But that evaporated somehow, and then it re-emerged around 1924 with the first groups. But then it also failed with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because they said the Mennonites are Russian state citizens, so there's no possibility to give them a Dutch status. So that was through diplomatic pressure, so to say. And further on, it was only by a contact with American Mennonites who had contact with Mexico. So that was in 1924, and that was the main canal, I think, they got their information in Rotterdam.
Thank you. Got a question up here at the front. Jeremy's just coming around. He'll bring the mic.
Well, the question I've got is it's interesting, you see the stages of the government trying to take over. My belief was that the government just came and took it. But I can see stages of how they took the things away from the Mennonites. Stage 1 is tax the heck out of them. They were taxed much higher than the Ukrainians. So the guys that had it were taxed at a very, very high pressure rates. The second way to screw them and take advantage of them was to stop their religious beliefs and stop their military exemption. That was second. And then I noted in 1927, the third one came about. They just went and took it and forced them out. So 3 stages of how the Mennonites lost it, but it started with, first of all, taxing them and then taking away their privileges, and then third of all, take it over. But, thank goodness, my 4 elders saw the writing on the wall in 1924, and they just got out. And they got nothing for it, but they got out with their lives. My dad was born in an estate, and my mother was raised by nannies. My mother ended up cleaning houses here in Winnipeg as a cleaning lady, and my dad worked as a caretaker after being born on an estate, and that was the end result. So the 3 stages, right? Tax, take away privileges, and then take it away.
James, did you want to respond to that question too? And what's your take on the stages? I think that's an appropriate.
You want me to respond? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, James.
Well, there's a term, technical term called teleology, which is reading the past through the present. In the 1970s, I interviewed a large number of immigrants from the Soviet Union. And all I can say is that a very large number of them came from the privileged areas of Russian society. And certainly they found that there was no future for them there. It did surprise me, I remember, that so many came from the upper regions, but it also surprised me to discover how wealthy some Mennonites had actually been. I think, you know, looking at the past through later events and claiming that you've been wise and could see the future is frankly a load of old rubbish, but never mind.
Yeah, hi. This is a quick question, I hope. So my grandparents ended up in Paraguay in 1930, and I grew up in Brazil. The question is, it always says that okay, they weren't allowed to go to Canada and then ended up going to Paraguay and Brazil. And what exactly, did Canada close the doors at that time? What exactly, it's always just said, you know, now they were encouraged to go to South America. Was Canada actually closing the doors for Mennonites?
I want to say that Canada closed the gates for a lot of immigrants who came from Europe, and it was allowed a new law in the 1919. And there was some quotas for new immigrants, and Mennonites at that time couldn't come. And only with the help of the Canadian Mennonites who pushed this question with the Canadian authorities, the Mennonites were allowed to come to Canada in the 1920s years.
As far as I know, Canada was closed in 1930, about 1930, and that was the reason the Mennonites from Siberia had fled to Moscow, and they had hoped to go to Canada, but Canada didn't allow them in at that moment because there were presidential elections. And after the elections, there was not a favorable regime, so everybody had to go elsewhere to South America, and that was the reason why they went to Brazil and Paraguay. That was decided, I think, in January 1930.
I noticed one of the comment is always about the central Ukraine area. My parents were from, my mother was from the Kuban, and the stories were always different. They were always the recipient of refugees from other places. And partly because things didn't get bad till later, my grandparents never made it out. It's a longer story. So just a comment whether some areas were in fact affected differently enough that that made a difference. The other comment is about Mexico. My family actually went to Mexico in 1921, a family of 13, but all on their own. And my mother was a Harbina who was supposed to go to Fahrenheim, 3 university girls, and they said, we didn't come all this way to be farm wives in Paraguay, and they went on their own to San Francisco, actually made it and became professors. So there's a lot of these individual stories, and I guess I'm always curious how many other individual stories there are, to what degree there's a central story, and whether these exceptions were a few or many.
Okay, my name is Peter Rempel. I just wanted to supplement the Dutch connections. My understanding is that the name Jansen originally submitted was Verband der Mennonitengemeinden in Süden Russland. And the Ukrainian government said, no, you can't call this Southern Russia anymore, and you can't call yourselves by a religious name. You have to be named something else. So it's not necessarily part of this notion that we were all definitely trying to be Dutch, though that was part of it. The other little supplement is in December 1921, B.B. Jans wrote a letter to the Queen of the Netherlands asking for her to help repatriate the Mennonites to their motherland. So that was another little Dutch or appeal to the Dutch sensitivities.
So, I already told that the leaders of the Mennonite unions were the representatives of a new Mennonite elite, so they were ready for compromises. Also, they were in their history when the Mennonite rejected their, sometimes German origins, so it was not new for them. And I also mentioned the name of Maltsev. Actually, that person, that was the head of NKVD at that time, he promised to, to trick with the title of the organization. So his promise was to call the Mennonite Union as the, the union of citizens of Dutch lineage. And so it was a reasonable step, and after that, all the doors were open for the Mennonites.
I'll add something about the Dutch connection. So this letter to Queen Wilhelmina is a very interesting story because the letter was constipated but never sent. So that's one. So there's only concept in the archives, and the Dutch Mennonites decided not to send it. So that's one. And the other is interesting because the Mennonites had invoked our Dutch lineage in the liquidation process in 1915-17 to avoid liquidation of their holdings. And that's when the Hollander argument first popped up, and that was also used by Mantsev. So when he wanted to recognize the Mennonite Verband, it couldn't be as a religious organization, it should be like some kind of national organization, because at that time all kinds of other national minorities had their own organizations, like the Germans. So he came up with the idea of Dutch lineage. So that's also because he knew about the story of the liquidation, and also because he knew some of the Dutch connections, and that is also what he suggested to Jans. And so actually the name of the Dutch connection in the Verband was on suggestion of Mantsev.
Yes, and I would say that Mantsev was in theme because, he was interested in religious history and was a friend of Bon Jabrievich. And so they know that experience during the First World War, then Mennonites were ready to recognize themselves, and there were a lot of publications in that period. So there's in the press. And Mantsev knew about that very well.
And there also had been some arguments between the Germans and the Mennonites concerning the Dutch lineage, especially between Unruh and Wilms in 1917.
All right, well, we will break for coffee now. Thank you so much for the four presenters. We'll give them one more round of applause.